Hello lords and ladies, it is I, Sir Gwaine, Evermere here. In today's video, I wanted to explore a point I often make when discussing Arthurian accuracy, that being King Arthur should be a child when he pulls the sword from its stone. Now I often say this, but I rarely ever actually explain why it's important. So in today's video, I'm going to go in depth and properly explain it. Firstly, let's get the obvious point out the way first. If King Arthur was not a child when he pulled the sword out of the stone, the wars at the beginning of Arthurian legend would not have taken place. At all. There's just no discussion here, as any kind of resistance would have been snuffed out immediately. They just wouldn't stand a chance. Almost every opposing king, ignoring King Lot and a select few kings who resisted Arthur for their own reasons, most kings resisted Arthur and went to war with him because he was a child, a boy king. A name given to Arthur by his enemies to insult and belittle his claim and right to rule. As a boy king is incapable of ruling a country, especially in the broken, tattered state Britannia was at the time. If he was a fully grown adult, most kings wouldn't have had much issue with him. Now you could make the argument they could just simply change the reason why they went to war with Arthur, but the political landscape of Arthurian legend is surprisingly a very tight web. Attempting to unravel one integral knot, such as Arthur's age, will cause the entire web to collapse in on itself. A lot of kings in Arthurian legend wanted to support Arthur, but the idea of bowing before a child was absurd, especially considering, at the time, Saxons were invading them. A sentiment often shared among King Lot's supporters was they needed a strong, firm leader who can lead them to victory against the invading Saxons, not a child who got lucky and pulled a sword out. Keep in mind, even if they fully agreed Arthur should be king, another question gets raised. Should he be king yet? He's an uneducated squire or peasant child who can't read and can't write, so how is he possibly going to understand the deep, complex twists and turns of politics in Britannia? What makes this so good is they are kind of right. Arthur struggles heavily as king, even if he was chosen for it. Another question that gets raised is, what authority makes him king? Yes, he pulled the sword from its stone, but some would just consider that to be an old folktale, while the other side would consider it to be the words of God. All of this creates this incredible political pull and push that, in my opinion, is part of the reason why Arthurian legend has lasted as long as it has. But making Arthur an adult lessens the impact of this entire idea, as if Arthur was an adult, most opposing kings would not oppose him. Instead, they would help him. You might be asking, but there's still kings that still oppose him, so not much has changed, right? No, because Arthur has a lot more forces at his command. Before, it was difficult for Arthur because he was fighting off half of Britannia, but if he was an adult, he would be fighting less than a quarter with the help of the rest of Britannia, which means that the early wars, they will end faster than they can begin, so the entire beginning wars of Arthurian legend disappear into thin air if Arthur was an adult. But ignoring that for a moment, why is it important that Arthur is a child? Simple. As people, we have certain hardwired instincts. One such instinct is the protection and care of children. Whenever we see a child in need or suffering, you feel this compulsion to help them, or at least feel bad for them, as we want to help them. Now, why is this important? Well, it's because of the emotional reaction to King Arthur's struggle is a lot lessened if he's an adult. If you want an outward reference to this, you have Chainsaw Man. If you aren't familiar, I would 100% recommend reading the first few chapters, but if you can't be asked, Denji is a 16 to 17-year-old boy. His father committed suicide when Denji was 10 to 12, leaving Denji with a massive debt to pay. Denji had to resort to selling his own body parts such as his eye, kidney, among other things, nearly getting himself killed daily, slaying devils. Now that you're caught up, I have a question. If Denji was a 26-year-old man who lost his father and gained his debt when he was, let's say, 20, would you feel as bad for him as you do in the story? The answer is no, you don't. Do you feel bad for him? Sure, you do. It's a terrible situation for anyone, but it's the fact that it's a child that makes it so much worse. This same idea applies to King Arthur. Yes, a grown man who is unprepared for the throne is a bad situation, but compared to a child, it's a completely different situation. An adult would be a lot more physically stronger, would be a lot more mature, and more importantly, be able to deal with the stress a lot better than a child, which is important when Saxons are invading your country. But even with all these points, you can still tell an Arthurian legend story with Arthur being an adult. Just change a few things here and there, so what's really the problem? The themes of Arthurian legend. I will admit, I've been avoiding this quite a bit, I won't deny it. There are a multitude of themes in Arthurian legend, but with dealing with Arthur, there is one in my opinion that stands out quite a bit, that being imposed responsibility. A bit cliche now, perhaps? We have superheroes that tackle this as well, but I feel King Arthur is a lot more impactful. The story of Arthur, in my opinion, is a story of what imposed responsibility can do to someone. We as a society tend to downplay those we see as gifted or chosen, as they were handed everything. But a question I often ask is this. If you, yes you, the person watching this video, as a 10 to 15 year old, pulled the sword from its stone, do you think you could do what Arthur did? Realistically, no. As a lot of people, I think, when they found out the responsibility that's put on their shoulders, they'll simply put the sword back into the stone and walk away. I'll even admit, I'd do it. It takes someone with a massive heart to even attempt to carry that burden. Although it was imposed at first, as Arthur was unaware of the responsibility of taking the sword, several times throughout Arthurian legend, Arthur could have just given the sword to someone else. King Lot even sympathizes with Arthur at one point, saying he should be at home playing with the village boys, not fighting in a war, and asking him to give him the sword so he can just go home. Keep in mind, this is King Lot. King Evil Tyrant Man Lot. Arthur's literal arch enemy in this point in the story sympathizes with Arthur. However, despite this, Arthur refuses. Why? Out of pride? Anger? Spite? No. Because he has a chance to genuinely help others. He takes the responsibility onto his shoulders, even as a child. Finally, the most important thing that I think a lot of people either don't know or forget is that King Arthur is a tragedy. It's not a grand heroic tale. Yes, there are heroic parts, such as the golden age of King Arthur, when he's in his physical prime, married to the lovely Queen Guinevere, the love of his life, fighting beside his best friend, Sir Lancelot. He has a round table of the greatest knights in all the land, and his land is pure bliss and peace. Any threat that arrives, he and his knights deal with. They even have time to go to other countries, such as France, which is where a lot of the French stories take place. This all leads to the big question. What could possibly go wrong? It's rather simple. The mistakes Arthur made when he was a child. It doesn't matter that he's managed to grasp his throne now. Did he seriously think managing to catch up was enough? That it would forgive everything? All the idiotic decisions made by a child that didn't know any better? The past never forgets, and it will haunt him, leading to the dark age of King Arthur and the fall of Camelot. King Arthur's story is not that of a grand king who reaches perfection. It's a story about a flawed boy trying to make the best of the worst situation, but being torn down anyway. His being a child just makes us feel cruel. It's not an idiotic decision made by a fully grown man who should have known better. It's a child trying his best, but just not knowing anything. It doesn't follow the hero's journey. It's something closer to Macbeth if Macbeth's major falling quality was his innocence and good-heartedness. If you generally want to understand how cruel Arthurian legend is to Arthur, look no further than Morgana, the villain of Arthurian legend. Why does she hate Arthur? Genuinely think about it. If you don't know, King Arthur caused her husband King Lot's death due to the wars, and he took over Britannia, leaving her feeling powerless, leading to her searching for power and something to regain control over her life, and this leads to her being a tyrant and wanting to destroy Arthur. Now, whether or not she cared about King Lot or not is up to the interpretation, but either way, it left her feeling powerless. Now, on the surface, this doesn't sound that unreasonable. except when you realise that King Lot started the war with Arthur, who was a child. She devoted her life to destroying a child. Like, really think about that for a moment. A grown woman who is usually 10-ish years older than Arthur, so a woman in her 20s, devoting her life to making a child as miserable as she can, all because Arthur basically went to war with her husband who started the war. Yet because of this, she massacres thousands of Arthur's people, sides with the Saxons, allowing them to take over Britannia by siding with them, and, well, to be blunt, forcing herself on Arthur to conceive Mordred. I do understand why they make Arthur an adult, as these are some very heavy themes for a lot of audiences. A lot of people would prefer the standard hero's journey where everyone's happy at the end, but that's just not what Arthurian legend is meant to be. If you like those versions, that's perfectly fine. Don't let me stop you. I'm not saying you're not allowed to enjoy these versions of these stories. It's just those versions of these stories are missing the point of Arthurian legend, as they are like alternate takes on the legend that frames it in a more positive light. And yet that's what the mainstream idea of King Arthur makes it out to be. It would be like if Romeo and Juliet were a romantic comedy film. It wouldn't make it a bad film, but if that were the mainstream idea of Romeo and Juliet, it would be a very frustrating and misleading idea of the story. If you want an example about why this is a bit jarring, let's look at King Arthur, The Legend of the Sword, a movie that massively flopped. But why? Although the movie had some good things about it, the probable reason is it's tackling the part of Arthurian legend that heavily hinges on Arthur being a child. In the movie, Arthur's a street rat who can fight. He's in his mid-20s when this conflict with King Lot starts, and it feels hollow. So, future Sir Gwaine here. I just entirely forgot this isn't King Lot, it's King Vortigern. Yeah, I bet you didn't remember that either. Now, I'm not saying turning him into a child would have saved that movie, but it's clear they had to rewrite massive portions of Arthurian legend to fit this new version. And so it fell on the writers to make basically a brand new story, all because they made him an adult. I'm actually going to do a full accuracy video on that movie, so I won't go fully in depth anymore. Now, I'm not saying it's 100% impossible to tell an Arthurian legend story without having Arthur be a child. However, there is a sentiment I think a lot of people need to start thinking of. If you're making a change to something that will drastically change the story, is what you're replacing it with better or just as good as what's already there? If not, don't make the change. It's that sentiment I feel a lot of Arthurian legend stories fall into, as they just cut the entire stories with Arthur as a child. So instead of changing or improving, they just remove it, so that Arthur can be an adult, which doesn't add that much to the story. If a movie decides to skip past Arthur being a child, that's fine, but removing it is the problem. That needs to be addressed by its narrative, as if it doesn't, it just feels jarring and wrong. Anyway, thank you for listening to my rant. Have a lovely day, lords and ladies. Let me know what you think about this situation in the comments.